Hi everyone, Dave Zurcher here, here to do a presentation for the Z-5 analog console. Just a quick introduction here for those who haven't seen one before. The Z-5 analog console is an adaptation of a P4 analog console that was developed in the late 70s, early 80s by Laser Systems Development Corporation. I've taken that design, augmented, improved, and added on to create what is today the Z-5. So what we have here is this entire section is pretty much what the P4 was and then added on to and changed. The only function this has here is X and Y. That's all this does. This only does the X signal, the Y signal, and does all kinds of crunching of all the analog signals together to make some pretty interesting outputs. In total, throughout the entire Z-5 console, there's 17 individual oscillators that some interact with each other as far as amplitude modulation and frequency modulation and so forth. After I developed this, and before I made so many different changes, I wanted a way to modulate color that was clean, and I had tried a number of DACs and never had anything that was really very, very good and really easily controllable. So I ended up just developing my own, and that's how the Z5C came about, which is the smaller panel here. On mine is a 2U panel. It's about all the room I had on my console here. But this handles all of the RGB color modulation internal for my console. I also later on developed the audio lays here, which is a device that will take an audio input, and as you can see, it's even taking my voice here, and converting it into several ranges here of audio, different frequency ranges that will then compare the input, the signal level, to a setting of a potentiometer here, and determine whether you want to pass that output to R, G, or B. And then you've got some attack and decay, gain, and whatnot settings to give you a nice RGB level based, or RGB color based on what the incoming audio signal is doing. So that's been a pretty nice feature for a hands-off while dealing with only manipulating X and Y. You can have that device doing color instead of having to do X, Y, as well as do color down here. It can be a bit challenging trying to do everything all at once. At any rate, that's kind of a quick overview of everything here. Z5, Z5C, the audio lays. I have some other devices here as well. I've got some just little ILDA signal routing stuff. This is a 2-channel ILDA switch where I can switch between a DAC input or some other input. And this side feeds through my console and then back out. I have another device here that is a 3-channel ILDA switcher that has some other effects where I can manipulate the gain, inverts, and color mapping going through that device. And I also have a wave USB here that I'm sending a test pattern through the system right now. I'll bring that up in just a moment. So just to go over kind of a basic function of the X and Y portion of the Z5, we have 3 of the VCQOs, which are voltage-controlled quadrature oscillators. In other words, they'll produce a sine and a cosine, or 2 sines with one being 90 degrees out of phase with the first one. So let me go ahead and bring that up here. As we can see, we have a sine going to X, cosine going to Y, and it produces a nice circle, and I've got it at a very low frequency at the moment. This oscillator you can bring all the way to a dead stop, and then up to the top end of the oscillator is about anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200 hertz. And so we'll bring that up. Hopefully the refresh rate on the camera isn't picking anything up bad. At any rate, so you have control over the gain of this, and you can add a couple additional oscillators here, the standard VCQOs. You can take away the cosine signal to where now it's only sending one signal out, in this case to the X-axis scanner, or I can only have it go to the Y-axis scanner. And then take the second oscillator and do the same thing, send only a sine from this oscillator and send him to the other axis, and it gives you more of the traditional looking patterns like this that you would see coming out of like a spirograph type thing. So another switch we have here in the main VCQO is sine and square. The oscillator itself is putting out both frequencies at the same rate, and so I can switch that to the square wave oscillator. And same for the other side, and you end up with an effect like that. So that's the basics here. From here, the signal gets fed to a VCA, which is a voltage-controlled amplifier, which I have control for right here. Now, this voltage-controlled amplifier have the ability to send it a signal from one of my low-frequency oscillators here for amplitude modulation. So if I go back to just a standard circle here, I'll take away one of the oscillators, and let's say I want the signal to come from LFO 1, and then I want to enable that. As you can see, the image is being modulated amplitude-wise by this low-frequency oscillator. I can bring that up quite a bit in frequency, and I don't know how well that's going to look on the being captured by a webcam like this, but certainly looks a lot better in person. All right, and so that's the function of the VCA, and that can be tied to either LFO, LFO1, or LFO2. And for different effect, there's gain and offset controls within that, determining how much modulation you want there. Then it can be in one direction and then bounce back to the other, kind of an effect. Again, I don't know how well that's going to get picked up. I can go either way. So once the signal leaves that area, and by this point, we also have an external image that can come into the Z-5, which can be a pre-recorded laser show or something from another DAC. In my case, I do have a signal coming from the Wave USB, and that comes into the Z-5 and goes directly to its own VCA. It's an independent VCA. This was added after the fact. So some of the stuff looks like it's just kind of thrown in because it is. This is the original panel that I've made so many modifications to. But this is an external image VCA, which allows for adding that same amplitude modulation to an external image. Now, I currently have the orientation test pattern being displayed through. I can switch between the internal or the external image with this slider here. And this slider just kind of morphs between the two. And if I had a better frequency here of the VCQO, find something stable, then it's a much smoother transition between the internal and the external image. And same for color, RGB color. That's coming obviously from the recorded image on the Wave USB. And I can switch over to the internal signal here, which I have just red turned on. I can turn that off and bring just green, just blue, and this is just kind of a hard turn on, no modulation. If I change it to lower setting, then I can add some modulation to it for any of the colors like that. All right, so you have to forgive me. I also made some notes here, make sure I don't forget anything. At any rate, so this is the VCA for the external image. I can assign that to LFO1 and go through and make some changes and have it do different things, or LFO2 and likewise, until I can find a nice harmonic that looks interesting or could go to the beat or anything to that effect. So another interesting fact here, these are tied also to the RGB modulation and to the color crossfade circuit. So when I turn this VCA down, it will also fade away the image, or the VCA gain potentiometer here, it also fades away the RGB color. And same for the internal here. If I turn this all the way down, it will fade away the image as well. So at any rate, once the signal gets past that point, the first VCA for the internal and external, it is then, before it gets fed to rotation offset, they do go through these internal image sliders here, which a quick adjustment can be made like this. It can be rotated upside down, backwards, inverted, or anything to that effect. That's the same for the internal image as well. So once I get past this point, we're at the stage of rotation offset, where an offset can be applied that's different from an image offset. So now if I were to apply a rotation on the y-axis with a y-axis rotation offset, this is the sort of effect we will see. As we can see, it's not rotating dead center in the image. Instead, it is kind of rotating with a center point off of the center of the image. And that would apply for both the X rotation and Y rotation with rotation offset, as well as for the Z-axis rotation, which if we apply that and then add some rotation offset, we will end up with that style of an effect. Now, some time ago, I guess it's been probably 2 years now, I wanted to find a way to better control that Z-axis rotation, which is when I was able to go out and find the this device here off to the right. It's kind of the only place I could add it. This is a sine cosine potentiometer that is a free-flowing potentiometer, contactless. When I enable that, the image is now tied to the position of this potentiometer. So, and as fast as I can rotate this potentiometer, as fast as the image will rotate as well. And if I apply an offset to that, now you can see what goes on there. All right. So once the image passes through the rotation offset circuitry, it ends up going to another section here called perspective. I'm not going to get too terribly in depth into this portion of it, but it is another VCA, or another voltage controlled amplifier part of the circuit that does some stuff heavily on rotation and adds some additional effects. Once it leaves that portion of it, we end up getting it into the image offset portion of it, which is different than rotation offset, and that now that I've applied a y-axis offset, as you can see, the image does still spin around the center of itself. So that portion of it, the image offset, can also be tied by way of a switch here to the joystick, where you can position the image like that. I've also added, I think this was at the last SELEM, I've added it recently as a damping for the image offset stuff from the joystick. So as you can see here, it's pretty quick, pretty hard, pretty jumpy. When I add damping, it's much smoother, and it just adds kind of a nicer, smoother effect when needed. Alright, so that pretty much covers the basics of the XY of the Z5. I'll now just go a quick rundown of the basic color from the Z5C here, as well as from the audio lays. So if I wanted to add color modulation here to this orientation test pattern, I'll need to move this pan slider all the way to the left so that I'm at internal color modulation. I'd already kind of set this up a little bit. And so now, as you can see, I have just a little bit of color modulation going on there with the external image. I can also add some chopping to that. The color oscillators, all of them go from anywhere from about 1 to 2 hertz all the way up to about 10,000 hertz. And most of them have a 3-way range switch for the 3 main oscillators here, as well as for the chopping. So if I change that up to the top, turn this 10 turn potentiometer fully clockwise, and we're looking at about 10 kilohertz of modulation. And they can also be selected between a sine wave, a square wave, or a ramp. And so that's the basics of the Z5C. The audio lays is a completely different animal than this. It's more of an automated thing. You make some settings changes and let it do its thing. As you can see, it is listening to my voice, so I'm going to flip over to that instead of coming straight through from the Wave USB. So now it's converting the frequencies of my voice into color, and I can add some damping and more slow fading of the colors themselves, or change the speed of how quickly they come up in brightness and whatnot, or their sensitivity and so forth. And I also have kind of a manual control there to adjust that. So at any rate, that's the audio lays, pretty basic. Lots of switches, lots of knobs, but does some pretty neat stuff. So let me switch back over to external color. Now this is basically my switch change here. Instead of getting color modulation from the audio lays, it's passing it through. Anything coming into the ILDA in port is now being passed through to the ILDA out port. In this case, I have the Wave USB connecting to the audio lays, from the audio lays to one of my ILDA switches, and from the ILDA switches to the Z-5. Okay, now to kind of get into some of the new things that I've been working on. I think the best thing to start with is probably going to be the foot pedal control that I've been working on. This allows a foot pedal to interface with the Z5 for some frequency modulation, for amplitude modulation, as well as some color modulation as well. So, and I have a panel here, it's kind of lower. I can add a picture of that. I didn't focus the main camera here on the interface that I have for that. But basically, if I have all three of the gain sliders for the VCQOs down, I can now apply pressure to the foot pedal to bring up the circle there. And that I've only got one VCQO selected as an add. I'm adding voltage to that, and that's why it's coming up. I can also change how fast that comes up or goes down. It can be fairly instant, or it can have leading edge delay and then no falling edge delay, or vice versa. So at any rate, now we have more of a falling edge delay there. And I can add, let's say, we'll bring up VCQO2, which, as you can see, we just have sine going to X. And I'm going to change its function to subtract for VCQO2. And so when I put full pressure on the foot pedal, I have added to VCQO1, which is off, but has now been brought all the way up, and I've totally subtracted VCQO2. And because of the delays involved there, you can see the slow fade one way and the other. And so that can be gone to, you know, beat of the music or something to that effect. So, all right, so that kind of covers that, the amplitude modulation of that with the foot pedal. For frequency modulation, we'll change the frequency for VCQO2 here. We'll do an add. And as I bring the foot pedal down, you can see the change in the frequency. Release the foot pedal and it'll come back. And I have the ability to delay how quickly it reacts to that. Either it's fairly instant, or it has a delay to get from one end to the other. And so that's frequency modulation. I have that set to where I can interface between all three of the main VCQOs here. So I'll turn that off. The next is color. I have the ability to add and subtract color. As you can see, we have red. This does need to be in the center. And we'll do that. Okay, so in this case, we want to subtract red. I'll press down on the foot pedal and it goes away. If I wanted to have it change between red and green, do that. Let me adjust the gain a bit. take my foot off the pedal, goes back to red, back on the pedal, back off the pedal. I can adjust how quickly the leading edge is, instant on the falling edge, and vice versa. Instant on the leading edge, slow on the falling edge. Or it can be both. Delay on the leading edge and delay on the falling edge. And so that's the function that I have so far on the foot pedal. It's not completely polished of a setup just yet. I still have some changes that I want to implement and improvements to make, but in its current form, this is the foot pedal interface. So, but it's coming along. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to share was the LFO crossfade that I have. So the low frequency oscillator, and I've got the outputs of the LFOs tied directly to a function that I call sweep here. Let me just expand this out a bit. So in the original system, the LFOs are able to output a square wave or a triangle/ramp wave. And I've decided to come up with a way that I can morph between the two instead of switch between the two. Previously, I did have a single switch to flip to have this output either a square wave or the triangle wave. Now I can morph between the two with the potentiometer here. Just to kind of show that, let me bring these up. So what you're seeing here is the output of both LFOs. So let me kind of put it into a bit of a oscilloscope mode. All right, hopefully that's coming out okay. So as we can see, mainly what we're seeing here is LFO2, whereas LFO1 is performing the sweep function. So if I take symmetry here, I can convert this into a ramp in that direction or a ramp in the opposite direction. Now if I leave it in the middle, now I can move my other potentiometer to morph between a ramp and a square wave. Pretty interesting function, and it's kind of makes some interesting effects, particularly for frequency modulation. At any rate, that is the change that I've made to the LFOs. I've made a change in the VCQOs where I now have added some slew rate to the square wave, whereas previously, if I disable slew rate here and I bring up, change that to square wave, it's extremely hard from one point to the next. I mean, we're running a fairly low frequency here. If I bring the frequency up, I'm currently running in my projector G120 scanners that are probably approaching 30 years old. So they do have a hard time at the upper end, and they are quite loud, as you can probably hear even through the microphone. So I've added a slew rate for each of the VCQOs to kind of mitigate that a little bit, make that a little cleaner. At the lower end, it is still pretty hard from one point to the next, but as you approach higher end, the slew rate starts to kick in and slows the speed of the scanner up to the point that it will begin to have nice rounded edges right about there, instead of the harder edges. And that even proved to be a pretty nice effect for some of the more complex abstracts with when adding square wave signals to them. Excuse me. So that's a change that was added to the VCQOs, and I have the 3 adjustments here on the side. I'll have to come up with something different when it comes to redesigning a new panel instead of having them over here. Okay, so recently I came up with the idea. I love amplitude modulation. It does some really cool effects, and I wanted to figure a way of adding another layer of amplitude modulation for the entire output of the console. So I have amplitude modulation for the 3 main VCQOs here, and then I have amplitude modulation for an external image here. And all of this occurs prior to rotation. And I wanted to find a way to have amplitude modulation for the entire image path after rotation. And so I ended up realizing, I mean, it took a while, but I finally realized that, well, this is a VCA here, perspective function, and that I could reassign zoom. It still functions as zoom. However, I can tie it to one of the LFOs to make it act as a VCA and give me the AM modulation that I was looking for. So let me change that back to sine. So similar thing here, if I assign him to a VCA, or excuse me. Okay, I kind of jumped over that part. All right, let me just back up a little bit here. I forgot to add that in this area here, I've added the ability to tie the individual VCQOs to an LFO for amplitude modulation. All right, so I have overall amplitude modulation here for the 3 combined, and then I have individual amplitude modulation here. And now, post all of this and rotation, I have amplitude modulation here, which adds another layer of effect for the output image. So when I tie VCQO 1 to an LFO, I can amplitude modulate it here. If I, let's say, add some offset, add some rotation, we'll turn that one off. Maybe we'll make it look like that. We'll leave it right about there. Now I can add some amplitude modulation from here. Again, controlled by the LFO. So you can do some pretty neat stuff from there. And rotation offset has a pretty interesting effect over that. So that works pretty well. Later on, I started thinking, well, that's interesting, but why not have an additional dedicated oscillator that could run amplitude modulation here post-rotation? So that's when I added another sine wave oscillator here. This oscillator is different from the LFOs in that it is more of a high frequency oscillator, going up to about 12 to 1300 hertz. So when I change the input here, instead of coming from LFO1 or LFO2, which in this case doesn't appear to be doing much, there it is, I can now change it to the new HFO, or the high frequency oscillator. In this case is here. This is the only available spot I could add this. We have the rate adjustment for this, and this is a sine wave as opposed to a square wave or a ramp. So it has kind of some nicer edges and corners at either end of the signal there. I can adjust the gain. I can adjust the offset. And just do some generally cool things with it. It's been a lot of fun having that there. Once again, post-rotation. I have been able to do some pretty interesting stuff with it. And after I implemented that there, I also added it here to the individual VCQOs. I can now tie these to either LFO1, LFO2, or to the new HFO for amplitude modulation as well as frequency modulation of the individual VCQOs. I know I didn't get into these, but that is what this is, and that would just extend this video out. Probably too long. At any rate, so that's the function of the new HFO, the new amplitude modulation at the Zoom potentiometer. Offers some pretty neat some pretty neat stuff that can be added. New paths to go as far as creating abstracts. At any rate, the next and final thing that I've added here is a new function for the joystick. So I got to thinking, well, now that I have post-rotation amplitude modulation, why don't I have a way of more easily manipulating rotation offset? I mean, you can do it up here, you can do some neat stuff just by doing this, but I thought, that's great, but why not tie that to the joystick and see what I can get? So I've added yet another switch here, and when I turn that switch on, I now have rotation offset tied to the joystick, but also going through the damping circuit here to make nice and smooth transitions. So as I'm moving this around, I am adjusting rotation offset for the image. I can still add image offset, but I also still have rotation offset going on as well. And so that has proved to be a very effective new effect that I'm able to do here. In fact, let me flip back over to this guy here. All right, so there is the orientation test pattern being amplitude modulated from the new HFO at the image zoom potentiometer. Now with rotation offset here, I kind of get some pretty interesting effects there as it's going from where the image position should be as an image, as a position rotation offset, down to the center as I am amplitude modulating the zoom function. And so it gives a pretty interesting 3D effect. Now when I add my other output that I have here, which when I say other output, I have two scan heads in my projector. If I flip the switch here, the other scan head will get tied to the Z-5, as you can see there. And I have the image being mirrored on the x-axis. And so having both of them like that, you can really start to get some pretty cool effects, either with the internal abstract stuff or with external imagery. And then I can obviously make adjustments here to offset and gain of that, make that completely go away, adjust offsets, or make that modulation come back and go away in different ways. So that works pretty good. Been pretty impressed by that. And I think that pretty much wraps up some of the new features that I've been working on here. Now that I've added a couple things to the XY stuff here, I'm probably going to be working on polishing up the foot pedal control interface and finishing up some other stuff. And that's about it. I'm looking forward to SELEM next year. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. Appreciate it.